Imagine standing at the gates of a Pennsylvania steel mill on a summer morning in 1975. You're about to walk into your shift, and before you even pass through those gates, the world changes. The smell hits you first. Sulfur, like 1,000 rotten eggs burning at once, mixed with coal smoke and something chemical that makes your eyes water. Then the noise bleeds through the brick walls. A constant metallic scream, punctuated every few seconds by impacts so loud your chest cavity vibrates. You can see the heat shimmer rising even from outside, and it's already 90 degrees in the shade. You walk through those gates, and for the next 8 hours, you'll work in temperatures that can hit 150 degrees. You'll breathe air so thick with graphite dust that when you cough it up 2 days later, it'll still be black. You'll handle metal hot enough to melt skin, operate equipment that could crush you in an instant, and work alongside men whose fathers and grandfathers died doing this exact same job. The noise will be so loud you'll develop a permanent ringing in your ears. The smoke will coat your lungs. And at the end of your shift, you'll walk back through those gates, covered head to toe in grime, and you'll do it all again tomorrow. But you'll also earn more money than any blue-collar worker in history. You'll support your family on a single income, own your home, take vacations. You'll belong to a brotherhood so tight that these men will know you by nickname for 30 years, but never learn your last name. You'll help build America, literally, physically, one pour of molten steel at a time. This is the story of what it was like to work in a Pennsylvania steel mill in the 1970s. This is the story of the last generation who could say with absolute certainty, "We made this country." And this is the story of how that world came apart. To understand why Pennsylvania became the steel capital of the world, you need to picture the landscape. Pittsburgh sits at a place where 3 rivers meet, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio. These rivers created a natural transportation hub that could move coal, coke, and finished steel to markets across the entire country. The Monongahela River alone earned a nickname, the hardest working river in the world. And they meant it. 22 miles of nearly unbroken industry stretched along its banks, all the way into downtown Pittsburgh. But the rivers were only part of the advantage. South of Pittsburgh, in Fayette and Westmoreland counties, there was something even more valuable. The Connellsville coal seam. This wasn't ordinary coal. It was the highest quality bituminous coal on earth, perfect for making coke, which is what you need to feed a blast furnace. Having the best coal right there, and having the rivers to move it, meant Pennsylvania could make steel cheaper and better than almost anywhere else in the world. By the early 1970s, the mills around Pittsburgh were still producing roughly 1/3 of all the steel made in America. Think about that for a second. One region, one river valley, making 1/3 of the steel for the entire country. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend unless you saw it yourself. The mills weren't just factories, they were city-states of fire and iron, sprawling across miles, employing tens of thousands of people, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never stopping. The big 3 companies dominated everything. US Steel, headquartered right in Pittsburgh, was the largest steelmaker in the nation, with 171,000 employees by 1979. Bethlehem Steel, over in the eastern part of the state, employed 165,000 people at its peak and produced 23.7 million tons of steel in 1973. Jones and Laughlin, the 4th largest steel company in the world, had over 42,000 workers at just their Pittsburgh mill alone. These companies didn't just employ people, they created entire ecosystems. Towns existed because the mill was there. Churches were built to serve mill workers. Bars opened on every corner because that's where men went after their shifts. Families measured time not by years, but by generations in the mill. That was the plan. That was the promise. And in the 1970s, it still seemed like a promise that couldn't be broken. Let's talk about what the work actually was, because unless you've been inside a steel mill, it's almost impossible to understand. A steel mill in the 1970s wasn't like a modern factory with robots and computers. It was a place where human beings wrestled with the most extreme forces of nature. Heat, weight, chemical violence, every single day. The process started at the blast furnace. These were massive towers, sometimes over 100 feet tall, where iron ore, coke, and limestone were combined at temperatures that reached 2,900 to 3,270 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to melt rock, hot enough that the metal glows white, not red, white. The men who worked the blast furnace were called keepers, and their job was to manage the release of molten iron from the bottom of that tower. When they drilled out the clay plug and the iron started flowing, you could feel the heat from 50 feet away. It would hit you like a wall. The air itself seemed to burn. Sparks and something called kish, which is basically graphite flakes, filled the air and settled on your skin. After a few years working the blast furnace, you developed this permanent shimmer on your skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove. It was graphite embedded in your pores. It marked you. Everyone could tell a blast furnace man just by looking at him. The absolute worst job in the entire mill was the coke plant. Every veteran steelworker will tell you the same thing. The coke plant was hell with the lid off. That was the phrase they used. Hell with the lid off. To make coke, you take coal and bake it in airless ovens at over 2,000 degrees. This drives off all the impurities and leaves you with nearly pure carbon, which is what you need for the blast furnace. But the process creates some of the most toxic smoke humans have ever manufactured. The men who worked on top of the coke batteries walked directly on top of ovens that were separated from the Inferno below by just inches of brick and iron. The ground was so hot that regular boots would soften and melt. Workers wore wooden clogs or modified their boots with thick wooden soles just to keep from burning their feet. When the Larry car dropped coal into the charging holes, the coal hit the hot oven floor and ignited instantly. A plume of smoke would shoot up through the chutes, a toxic cocktail of benzene, toluene, and coal tar that the workers breathed directly for 8 hours at a time. Gordon Davis started working at a coke plant in 1974. Decades later, he still remembered his first impression. It was like, oh my God, this is hell. Smoke and fire, and it was just incredible. I almost ran out of there. It was like a dungeon. But he didn't run. He stayed. He worked there for years, like thousands of other men, because the alternative was no job at all. The work followed a rotating shift schedule that workers described as merciless. 7 days on day shift, 7 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, then 2 days off, then 7 days on swing shift, 3 in the afternoon to 11 at night, 24 hours off, then 7 days on midnight shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, then 4 days off, and the whole cycle started over again. Your body never adjusted. You never settled into a rhythm. You were always exhausted, always off balance, always fighting your own biology. The routine of each shift followed its own brutal logic. You'd arrive at the mill about 20 minutes early to change into your work clothes in the changing house. These were thick, heavy garments designed to protect you from heat and sparks. Canvas pants, thick cotton shirts, heavy leather aprons if you worked near the furnaces, steel-toed boots with metatarsal guards to protect the tops of your feet from falling metal. Some men wore wooden clogs over their boots in the coke plant where the ground got so hot that rubber soles would melt. Then you'd punch in and walk to your station. The walk itself could take 15 minutes in a mill that stretched for miles along the river. You'd pass through different temperature zones, from the relative cool of the entrance to the inferno of the blast furnace area. By the time you reached your station, you were already sweating. The first hour of the shift was usually the busiest. Equipment that had been idle or running at reduced capacity during shift change had to be brought back up to full production. The foreman would brief you on any problems from the previous shift, any equipment failures, any quotas that needed to be hit. Then you'd get to work, and for the next 7 or 8 hours, you'd be in constant motion. And through all of this, the noise was constant and overwhelming. Studies measured noise levels in the mills at 85 to 110 decibels continuously. Some impact sounds from the forging operations peaked at 148 decibels. That's louder than a jet engine at takeoff. You couldn't hear the person next to you unless they were screaming directly in your ear. Frank Beham, whose family worked at Bethlehem Steel for 4 generations, used to joke about it. He said none of his co-workers needed microphones at union meetings because they all had hearing problems. Everyone was already shouting. The smell was sulfur mixed with burning coal, hot metal, and chemicals. You could smell the mill from miles away. People who lived near the plants said you always knew what shift it was by the smell in the air. Gordon Davis remembered specific odours. Some pungent, some burning, and things that smelt like mothballs. Come to find out later that was actually one of our byproducts. The heat was unrelenting. Modern studies have measured wet bulb globe temperatures in steel mills at 31 to 41.7 degrees Celsius in the work areas. Near the coke ovens, direct temperature readings hit 153.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Men sweated through layers of protective clothing. Dehydration was constant. Heat stroke was common. Burns and blisters were just part of the job, so routine that guys wouldn't even report them unless they were serious. John Huey worked the carry furnaces from 1947 to 1982. He remembered that when he started, they didn't give you much protective gear at all. Just an asbestos coat, no hard hat, no fire-resistant clothing. He watched men's regular street clothes burst into flames in the cast house before protective equipment became standard. You learned fast, or you got hurt. Sometimes you learned fast and got hurt anyway. Specific jobs carried specific dangers. The scaffer, for example, walked onto hot steel slabs or stood on a bridge above them, using a massive oxyacetylene torch to burn off surface imperfections. He worked in a constant shower of sparks and iron oxide smoke, wearing heavy leather that barely protected him. The hooker, which was a job title that caused endless confusion outside the mill, worked on the ground with chains and cables, attaching lifts of steel to overhead cranes. It was called a crusher job because the risk of getting crushed by shifting loads was constant. These men lived by hand signals, communicating with the crane operator high above in total silence, a language of fingers and fists that could mean the difference between life and death. So why did men stay? Why did they walk through those gates every day into that heat, that noise, that danger? Part of it was money, which we'll talk about in a minute, but part of it was something else, something harder to define but just as powerful. It was the Brotherhood. Halfway through each shift came the lunch break, 30 minutes to eat if nothing went wrong. Men would gather at lunch benches scattered throughout the mill, usually in areas that were slightly less hot and slightly less noisy. They'd open their lunch buckets, these metal pails they'd packed at home, sandwiches, thermoses of coffee, maybe some fruit. The food was simple because anything fancy would get ruined in the heat. Some guys swore their coffee was boiling by lunchtime just from the ambient temperature. This is when the talking happened, the storytelling, the jokes, the complaints about wives and foremen and management. This is when you learned who was having money troubles, who was getting divorced, whose kid made the football team. The lunch bench was where the Brotherhood was built, one 30-minute break at a time. Pete DiPietro, who was union president of Local 2599, put it this way: "The best thing about working in the plant was the friendship, the community of the fellow steelworkers. Remembering all the good times you had sitting on the lunch benches, sitting around the lunch table with the guys discussing their personal lives. You didn't know their last names. You knew their first names and their nicknames. It was your second family. Believe me, it was." The nickname culture in the mills was legendary. Men were known as the Deacon, or PH, or Spaghetti Bender, or Evil Knievel. These weren't casual nicknames. They were identities that stuck for decades. You might work alongside a guy for 30 years and never know his actual last name, but you'd know everything about his life, his wife's name, his kids, his troubles, his hopes. The mills created bonds that went deeper than a lot of family relationships, and those bonds weren't just emotional, they were survival. Russ Picala explained it simply. You always look out for each other. You can't see everything. Sometimes you warn somebody when he gets in a bad position. Richie Check, who worked the blast furnaces where his father and 7 brothers also worked, said it even more directly. Somebody always watching somebody, that was what was the idea, kept everybody safe and alive. The mills ran on multi-generational families. Frank Behan represented 4 generations at Bethlehem Steel. Everybody worked at the steel going back to my grandfather. The Czech family sent 9 brothers into the blast furnace department. 9 brothers, all working the same Inferno, all looking out for each other. Vincent Brugger expected to follow his father and grandfather because, as he put it, "I learned from their conversations that they were making history with the things that they were making." This wasn't just a job. It was an identity woven into the fabric of your family's story. Paul Cochise was born a block from Bethlehem Steel in 1929. He admitted there was something about the place that pulled at him. There was something about the place, I guess it had a magnetism to it. When I got my job down there, I loved it. Some people used to say you got to be crazy liking this place. But he did love it. They all did, in their way. Not because it was easy or safe or pleasant, but because it meant something. Because they were building things that lasted. Because they were part of something bigger than themselves. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the story gets complicated. The 1970s were absolutely brutal for most American workers. Inflation was out of control. The oil crisis in 1973 sent gas prices through the roof. Unemployment was rising. The economy was a mess. But steelworkers were making the best money blue-collar America had ever seen. The 1973 contract between the United Steelworkers Union and the major steel producers was historic. It made American steelworkers among the highest-paid industrial workers on the entire planet. The contract included something called the Experimental Negotiating Agreement, where the union agreed to give up the right to strike nationally in exchange for guaranteed wage increases. Minimum 3% annual raises, plus a cost of living adjustment, plus a $150 bonus. Every year, automatically, whether the company made money or not. By 1980, the average manufacturing worker in Pittsburgh was earning $360.89 per week. That was roughly $70 more than the state average and $70 more than the national average. But it wasn't just the paycheck. The benefits were incredible. Substantial pensions that actually meant something, $8 to $10 for every year of service. Life insurance. Comprehensive medical coverage, including psychiatric care if you needed it. Supplemental unemployment benefits. 8 paid holidays a year. And here's the one that really stands out. Extended sabbatical vacations. 13 weeks off, paid every 5 years for senior workers. One income could support an entire family. You could buy a house, you could afford a car, you could take your kids to the shore in the summer, you could have a life that didn't involve constantly scrambling to make ends meet. In an era when most of America was struggling, steelworkers had genuine security. The communities these wages supported were incredibly diverse. The 1970 census captured the ethnic tapestry of Pittsburgh's steel neighborhoods: 72,432 Poles, 69,593 Slovaks, 25,842 Serbo-Croatians, 11,668 Ukrainians, thousands more from Italy, Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Each group clustered in distinct neighborhoods with their own churches: Slovak churches, Polish churches, Croatian churches, Hungarian churches, Ukrainian churches. Many of these churches were founded specifically to serve steelworkers and their families. Joe Achando, who spent his career in the mills, thought this diversity was actually a strength. I think it became a great company because they had diversified people, different nationalities. If a Hungarian worked alongside of a Slovak, and he was going pretty fast, that Hungy didn't want that Slovak to outwork him. There was competition, sure, but it was the kind of competition that pushed everyone to be better, to work harder, to prove themselves. It created a culture of pride in the work itself. But here's where we need to be honest about something. This prosperity, this security, this brotherhood, it wasn't distributed equally. Not even close. The steel industry's relationship with black workers was one of systematic exploitation, and there's no way to tell this story honestly without confronting that directly. African American workers were recruited heavily during the Great Migration and during both World Wars when the companies desperately needed labor. But once they were in the mills, they were channeled into specific jobs, the dirtiest jobs, the most dangerous jobs, the lowest paying jobs. And they were kept there by a system that was designed specifically to trap them. The coke ovens and the blast furnaces were dominated by black workers. Veterans called these man-killing jobs, or Negro jobs, and they meant it literally. At the carry furnaces, the furnace division was 99% black. The maintenance division, where the skilled trades worked, where the pay was better and the conditions were safer, was almost 99% white. This wasn't an accident, this was policy. The mechanism that enforced this was something called departmental seniority. Under this system, you only accumulated seniority within your specific department. So if you were a black worker who'd spent 20 years in the coke plant and you wanted to transfer to the rolling mill or the electrical shop, you had to start over at the bottom. You lost all your seniority, you took a pay cut, and you'd be the first person laid off if things got slow. It was a trap with no escape. One black steelworker, whose testimony was recorded in oral history archives, captured the bitter reality perfectly. A white man would come in and you had to train him. In 2 weeks he was your boss. Think about what that means. You spend years learning a job, mastering a craft, proving yourself every single day. Then a white guy walks in off the street. You teach him everything you know, and within 2 weeks he's supervising you. That was the system. That was normal. But in 1974, something changed. After years of litigation by the NAACP, the Department of Justice, and agitated rank and file, workers who were done accepting this system, 9 major steel companies and the United Steelworkers Union signed what's known as the Consent Decree. This was a landmark civil rights settlement that fundamentally rewrote the rules. The Consent Decree mandated plant-wide seniority instead of departmental seniority. Now your seniority was calculated from your date of hire at the plant, period. It didn't matter what department you were in. This meant black workers could finally bid on jobs in departments that had been effectively whites only without losing the years they'd already served. The decree also included something called rate retention, which meant if you transferred to a new department at a lower entry-level wage, you could keep your higher previous wage for a period of time, and it set goals. 50% of all new openings in trade and craft positions had to be filled by minorities and women until their representation matched the local labour force. On paper, this was a massive victory. In practice, the reaction on the shop floor was intense and often ugly. Many white workers viewed their departmental seniority as a property right they'd earned through years of hard work. They saw the consent decree as the government taking away their job security and giving it to people who, in their view, hadn't paid their dues. This fueled a surge of racial tension that had always been there under the surface, but now erupted openly. Tools belonging to black workers who transferred into white departments would vanish. Lockers were vandalized. Racial slurs appeared on walls and benches. One of the most common tactics was the silent treatment. A black electrician entering a previously all-white shop might find that no one would speak to him. No one would answer his questions. No one would offer assistance on complex jobs where a second set of hands was essential for safety. They'd freeze him out, hoping he'd give up and go back where he came from. The union was caught in an impossible position. The leadership of the United Steelworkers, led by I.W. Abel, had signed the decree partly to avoid potentially bankrupting lawsuits. But in doing so, they alienated a massive block of their white membership. This resentment didn't just disappear, it festered. Many historians point to this moment as laying the groundwork for what would later be called Reagan Democrats, white working-class voters who felt abandoned by the liberal coalition they'd traditionally supported. And here's the truly bitter irony. Just when black workers finally got access to the better jobs, to the skilled trades, to the positions they'd been excluded from for decades, the industry started dying. Labour historian Ruth Needleman put it devastatingly. Just when they got their rights, the downsizing began. All that fighting, all that struggle, all those years of litigation, and the victory came right as the mills were starting to close. The door opened just as the building started burning down. The consent decree didn't just address race, it also forced the mills to open their gates to women. And if black workers faced hostility when they tried to move into white departments, women faced something even more intense when they tried to enter the mills at all. Women had worked in the mills before, during World War II, when the men were overseas fighting, the Rosie the Riveter era. But they'd been systematically pushed out after the war ended. By the 1970s, the mills were almost entirely male spaces, and a lot of the men wanted to keep it that way. The first wave of women who entered the Pennsylvania mills in 1975 and 76 walked into what can only be described as a hostile work environment. That phrase doesn't quite capture it. They walked into a war zone. The mills weren't built for women because they'd never been designed to accommodate women. There were often no women's restrooms, no women's changing houses. Women recounted having to walk half a mile to the main office building just to use a toilet during their shift. They had to change into their work clothes behind makeshift cardboard screens set up in the corner of a machine shop while men catcalled them. The sexual harassment was open, graphic, and relentless. Pornography was taped to the walls of crane cabs and lunchrooms. Women were subjected to constant propositions, groping, threats. The refrain they heard constantly was, "You're taking a man's job," as if the job belonged to men by divine right, as if women had no business being there, as if their very presence was theft. The hazing took on a menacing edge. Women reported having peepholes drilled into their shower stalls. The threat of sexual violence was always present, especially in the isolated corners of the mill. The tunnels, the shanties, the night shifts when fewer people were around. Some women carried weapons, some made sure they were never alone. All of them lived with a level of fear that the men didn't have to think about. But thousands of women stuck it out. They adapted. They learned. They found ways to do the work using their bodies differently than the men did. One woman who became a pipe fitter explained it this way. I couldn't muscle a valve open like the guys, so I used a cheetah bar, which is a pipe extension that gives you leverage, to get torque. It wasn't about raw strength. It was about mill sense, about understanding physics and leverage and using your brain. The equipment was a major issue. Safety gear was only available in men's sizes. Metatarsal boots, fire-resistant jackets called greens, gloves, all of it designed for male bodies. A woman stumbling around in boots 2 sizes too big wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. It was a safety hazard to herself and to everyone around her. Some women learned to modify their own equipment, stuffing the toes of boots with newspaper, layering smaller gloves inside larger ones. Slowly, very slowly, some women forged alliances. They found that while some men were openly hostile, others were what you might call paternalistic, willing to help, though often with a condescending attitude that made it clear they thought women needed help because they were women, not because everyone needs help when they're learning a dangerous job. But over time, as women proved they could do the work, as they showed up day after day and pulled their weight, the hostility in some crews softened into grudging respect. Notice I said some crews. The systemic sexism remained. The assumptions remained. The infrastructure never really caught up. Women who worked in the mills in the 1970s were pioneers, but they were pioneers in a place that didn't want them there and never fully accommodated their presence. While all this social turmoil was happening on the shop floor, something else was going wrong at the top. The relationship between the United Steelworkers Union and the steel companies in the 1970s was built on a kind of mutually assured destruction pact. Both sides thought they were being smart. Both sides thought they were protecting their interests. But what they actually did was lock themselves into a death spiral. We already talked about the experimental negotiating agreement in 1973, where the union gave up the right to strike in exchange for guaranteed wage increases. The logic made sense at the time. Before the agreement, every time a contract was coming up for negotiation, customers would stockpile foreign steel because they were worried about a strike disrupting supply. Then after the union and the companies reached a deal, there'd be layoffs because everyone already had plenty of steel stockpiled. The boom and bust cycle was brutal for workers and expensive for companies. So they made a deal. Stability in exchange for guaranteed raises, no strikes, no stockpiling, steady production. It should have worked, but it didn't because the agreement had a fatal flaw. It decoupled wages from productivity. The steel companies were now contractually obligated to raise wages every year, whether productivity improved or not, whether they were making money or not, whether they could afford it or not. Labour costs soared just as the industry's ability to compete was collapsing. And why was their ability to compete collapsing? Because while American steel executives were patting themselves on the back for labour peace, their international competitors were eating their lunch. Japanese steel companies and German steel companies were reinvesting profits into research and development. They were building basic oxygen furnaces that could make steel in 45 minutes instead of 8 or 9 hours. They were installing continuous casting systems that let them skip entire steps in the production process. They were getting leaner, faster, more efficient. The technological gap was staggering, and getting worse every year. A Japanese steel mill in Twice. The 1970s looked like something from the future compared to an American mill. The Japanese had embraced automation. Computer controls managed temperatures and chemical compositions with precision that human operators couldn't match. The furnaces were newer, more efficient, built with the latest refractory materials that lasted longer and performed better. American mills, meanwhile, were still operating blast furnaces that had been built in the 1890s. They'd been patched and rebuilt and upgraded over the decades, sure, but the fundamental design was Victorian. The same was true of the open hearth furnaces. These weren't antiques being preserved in museums. These were the primary production facilities for some of the largest steel companies in the world. The productivity numbers reflect this gap. A Japanese steelworker in the 1970s produced roughly twice as much steel per man-hour as an American steelworker. But here's the thing. It wasn't because Japanese workers worked harder or were more skilled. It was because they had better equipment. Give an American steelworker a modern basic oxygen furnace and a continuous caster, and he'd match Japanese productivity. But nobody was giving him those tools. Management wouldn't invest in them. Meanwhile, American steel executives were, and there's really no gentle way to put this, living like kings while their companies rotted from the inside. Journalist John Strohmeyer documented what he called the golf course culture at Bethlehem Steel in his book Crisis in Bethlehem. The company maintained not one, not two, but 3 corporate golf courses built with company funds. They had a fleet of corporate jets. They had chauffeured limousines. Executives were insulated from reality in a bubble of perks and privilege that made it almost impossible for them to see what was coming. When anyone suggested that maybe, just maybe, they should modernize their equipment, executives pointed to their open hearth furnaces and said these are perfectly good. We just spent millions upgrading them. Why would we replace them? This is what's called the sunk cost fallacy. They'd invested so much money in old technology that they convinced themselves they couldn't afford to replace it with new technology, so they kept operating with a system that put them at a permanent disadvantage against competitors who'd already moved on. American mills were still using open hearth furnaces that took 8 or 9 hours to make a heat of steel. Japanese mills were using basic oxygen furnaces that did it in under 45 minutes. American mills were still casting ingots, then letting them cool, then reheating them to roll them into shape. Japanese mills had continuous casting systems where the steel flowed like water directly into slabs. By the 1970s, it took American integrated mills 10 to 15 man-hours to produce a ton of steel. Japanese mills were doing it in 5. Instead of fixing the problem, instead of modernizing, American steel companies lobbied Washington for protection. They wanted tariffs. They wanted quotas. They wanted trigger price mechanisms that would block foreign competition. They treated the symptom instead of the disease. And the disease kept getting worse. For Bethlehem Steel's operations in the Conemaugh Valley, the end of an era came suddenly, violently, almost biblically. Johnstown was a city defined by flooding. Everyone knew the history. The Johnstown flood of 1889 killed 2,208 people. The 1936 flood was nearly as devastating. So when the skies opened up on July 19th, 1977, people knew to be afraid. A massive storm system stalled over the valley. In 24 hours, nearly 12 inches of rain fell. The hillsides were already saturated from earlier storms. They couldn't absorb any more water, so the rain just ran off, pouring down into the valley, swelling every creek and stream and river until they burst their banks. The Bethlehem Steel plant stretched for 13 miles along the Conemaugh River. When the flood hit, it hit with the force of a tidal wave. Torpedo cars, rail cars that carry molten iron and weigh hundreds of tons, were lifted off their tracks and scattered like toys. Soaking pits where steel ingots are heated were suddenly underwater. When water hits hot refractory brick, it flashes to steam instantly. The explosions were deafening. The electrical systems of the plant, miles of wiring and controls and switches, all of it was shorted out and buried under feet of toxic, oily mud. 84 people died across the valley that day. The damage totaled $340 million. For Bethlehem Steel, the flood was a decision point. The company had already been looking to downsize the aging Johnstown works. They'd been looking for a reason. The flood gave them one. It provided the force majeure they needed. They repaired the newest sections of the plant, the car shop, the parts that were still profitable, but they used the disaster as justification to permanently close the older, less efficient lines. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, employment at the Johnstown plant dropped by 4,000 workers. 4,000 families suddenly without income. 4,000 men who'd expected to work there for life, who'd planned on passing those jobs to their sons, suddenly out on the street. It was the beginning of the end. The glory days were washed away in a torrent of mud and debris, and it would only get worse from here. At the same time the mills were dealing with floods and foreign competition and internal dysfunction, they were also fighting a war on another front, the environment. The 1970s was the decade when America finally said enough. Enough smoke, enough poison, enough sacrificing public health for private profit. The Clean Air Act passed in 1970. The Environmental Protection Agency was created. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was established to protect workers. For the first time in American history, there were federal regulations with real teeth governing how much pollution factories could emit and how dangerous working conditions could be. For the steel industry, this was a reckoning. The phrase smoke means work had been etched into the collective consciousness of steel towns for generations. The graphite dust that coated porch railings and ruined laundry, the orange glow in the night sky, the sulfur smell that never quite went away, all of it was tolerated because it meant jobs. It meant prosperity. But epidemiological studies had proven what everyone suspected. The smoke was killing people. The most significant battle was over the coke ovens. Studies had established beyond any doubt that workers in the coke plants, especially the men working topside where the charging smoke was worst, developed cancer at catastrophically higher rates than the general population. In 1976, OSHA issued a strict new standard for coke oven emissions. The standard mandated engineering controls, better seals on the ovens, vacuum systems on Larry cars, strict requirements for respirator use. The steel industry fought the standard all the way to the Supreme Court. They argued it was technologically impossible to meet the requirements. They argued it would be economically ruinous. They argued it would force them to close plants and lay off workers. They lost. The Supreme Court upheld the standard, and the companies had to comply. Compliance meant spending millions of dollars on non-productive capital. Scrubbers to clean exhaust. Water treatment plants to handle runoff. Baghouses to capture particulate matter. All of this was absolutely necessary for public health and worker safety. But from the company's perspective, it was money that didn't increase production. It didn't improve efficiency. It didn't make them more competitive. It just kept them from killing quite so many people. This created a vicious cycle. The mills needed to invest in modernization to compete with foreign producers, but they also needed to invest in environmental controls to comply with federal law. They didn't have enough capital to do both. so they did the bare minimum on environmental compliance and did essentially nothing on modernization. And every year they fell further behind. Each Pennsylvania steel town had its own distinct character, its own identity shaped by the particular mill that dominated it and the ethnic groups that had settled there. These weren't just bedroom communities, they were mill towns in the deepest sense, places where the mill was the sun around which everything else orbited. Braddock was ground zero. Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Works opened there in 1875 as America's first modern steel mill. By the 1970s, Braddock's streets were packed, with bars, churches, and boarding houses. Slovak families, Italian families, Croatian families, Hungarian families, all of them living within walking distance of the mill. The mill whistle was the town clock. Everyone knew what time it was by which shift was changing. Today, Edgar Thomson is the last surviving integrated steel mill in the Pittsburgh area, employing about 900 workers where thousands once laboured. Homestead carried the weight of history like a physical burden. The Homestead Strike of 1892, where 10 workers died in a battle with Pinkerton agents hired by Carnegie, remained part of living memory in the 1970s. Families passed down stories. Grandfathers told grandsons about the Bost building, the strike headquarters that still stood. When the Homestead Mill finally closed in 1986, the site eventually became the Waterfront, a shopping centre. The irony would have stunned anyone from the 1970s workforce. Johnstown was defined by catastrophe. 3 devastating floods shaped the city's identity as much as steel did. People measured time by floods. Before the 1889 flood, after the 36 flood, after the 77 flood. The 1977 flood struck while the industry was already in decline, a double blow from which the town never truly recovered. The combination of natural disaster and economic collapse hollowed out Johnstown in ways that are still visible today. Bethlehem, in eastern Pennsylvania, had a company town atmosphere distinct from Pittsburgh's constellation of mill towns. Bethlehem Steel dominated the Lehigh Valley the way Carnegie had once dominated Braddock. The blast furnace stacks became iconic, visible for miles, a skyline more recognizable than any building. When those furnaces went cold on November 18, 1995, it marked the end of an era. Today those stacks are preserved as steel stacks, an entertainment venue. They light them up at night for concerts and festivals, a ghost of the fire they once contained. The culture of the steel towns in the 1970s was working-class America at its most concentrated. After a shift ended, men didn't rush home. They stopped at the neighbourhood bar. These were no-frills working-class institutions, dimly lit, cash only, built on camaraderie. The jukeboxes played Led Zeppelin, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and country rock. Men played pinochle. They argued about politics and sports and their foremen and their wives. They unwound from the brutal heat and the deafening noise in the only way they knew how. Every neighbourhood had its own bar, sometimes multiple bars on a single block. In Homestead, you could walk down 8th Avenue and hit a dozen different taverns, each one with its own regularity clientele, its own particular atmosphere. The Serbian Club, the Croatian Club, the Polish Falcons Hall. These weren't just bars. They were community centres, places, where immigrants and their children and grandchildren maintained connections to the old country while building new lives in America. The ethnic neighbourhoods were distinct and proud. In Braddock, you could tell which street you were on by which language you heard being spoken. Polish on one block, Slovak on the next, Italian the block after that. The churches reflected this diversity. Most neighbourhoods had multiple Catholic churches, each one serving a different ethnic community. Holy Trinity for the Poles. Saints Peter and Paul for the Croats, St. Michael for the Slovaks. Mass might be at the same time every Sunday, but you went to your church, the one where the prayers were in your language, where the priest understood your particular history. The women in these communities held everything together in ways that often went unrecognized. While the men worked the mills and drank at the bars, the women raised the children, managed the households, maintained the social networks that kept the community functional. They were the ones who organized church bazaars and neighborhood festivals. They were the ones who made sure that when someone got sick or lost a job, there was food on their table and someone checking in on them. The daily rhythm of life in a steel town was dictated by the mill whistle. You could hear it for miles. 3 shifts, 3 whistles. 7 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 11 at night. The whistle told you what time it was without checking a clock. It told you when your husband was coming home. It told you when to start dinner. It told you when to go to bed. It organized time itself around the production of steel. The neighborhoods closest to the mills were the roughest. The air was worse. The noise was constant. But the rent was cheap, and for immigrants and young families just starting out, cheap rent mattered more than clean air. As you move further from the mill, the neighborhoods got nicer, the houses got bigger, the air got cleaner. This created a geography of class within the working class itself. The foreman lived in a better neighborhood than the laborer. The skilled tradesman lived in a better neighborhood than the common mill hand. But everyone, from the company president to the newest hire, lived in the shadow of the mill. You could see the blast furnace stacks from anywhere in town. At night, the orange glow lit up the sky. You could smell the mill. You could hear it. It was omnipresent, unavoidable, the fact around which all other facts organized themselves. The beer they drank was local. Rolling Rock, brewed in Latrobe, 40 miles from Pittsburgh, was the Pennsylvania Steelworker beer. Its production peaked in 1974 at 720,000 barrels. Iron City was Pittsburgh's own. These beers weren't fancy. They were working man's beers, cold and cheap, and available in every bar in every mill town. The trucks they drove were American, Ford F-150s, Chevy C10, pickups. Full-size sedans like the Ford LTD, the Chevy Impala, the Pontiac Bonneville. Younger workers bought muscle cars when they could afford them. Camaros, Firebirds, Mustangs. After the oil crisis in 1973, smaller cars started appearing on American roads, but working-class men resisted. Their identity was tied up in those big American vehicles. And then there were the Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers weren't just a football team, they were identity made flesh. The Steel Curtain defense, named in 1971 as a play on Iron Curtain, embodied the toughness that steelworkers prided themselves on. 4 Super Bowl victories in 6 years. Super Bowl 9, 10, 13, 14. This gave the region civic pride at exactly the moment when the mills were starting to fail. The players were folk heroes. Jack Lambert, Franco Harris, Mean Joe Green. These men played football the way steelworkers made steel. Hard, physical, unbreakable. When Mean Joe Green appeared in that Coca-Cola commercial in 1979, tossing his jersey to a kid after the kid gave him a Coke, it resonated because Green represented something real. He wasn't a corporate spokesman. He was one of them. The movie The Deer Hunter, released in 1978, captured this world with devastating accuracy. Robert De Niro playing a steelworker from Clairton, a mill town just south of Pittsburgh. The film opens with scenes inside an actual steel mill, the orange glow and the noise and the danger. Then it shows the bar scenes, the wedding with its cookie table, the Orthodox church service, the deer hunting trips to the Alleghenies. Everything that defined the culture. Even the Russian roulette scenes in Vietnam, as horrific as they are, resonate because they're about men who gambled with death every single day in the mills, who understood risk in a way that most Americans couldn't. The warning signs had been accumulating for years, but in the 1970s they accelerated from worrying to catastrophic. 1959 had been a turning point, though nobody fully understood it at the time. That was the year of the longest steel strike in American history, 116 days. While American steelworkers were on the picket lines, American customers discovered they could buy Japanese steel. And Japanese steel was good. It was cheap. It was reliable. After 1960, America became a permanent net importer of steel. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Steel imports were 2% of US production in 1955. By 1970, they'd risen to over 15%. By 1977, they were above 20%. At the same time, Japanese producers were achieving labor productivity of around 5 man-hours per ton, while American integrated mills were still at 10 to 15 man-hours per ton. The 1973 oil crisis hit steel particularly hard. Steel production is incredibly energy-intensive. When energy prices more than doubled almost overnight, the economics of American steel got even worse. The recession that followed the oil crisis caused U.S. steel consumption to drop from 137 million tons to 89 million tons. Demand collapsed. Production collapsed. Jobs started disappearing. September 19, 1977, Black Monday. Youngstown Sheet and Tube shut down its Campbell Works, laying off 5,000 workers in a single stroke. The shockwave hit Pennsylvania immediately. Bethlehem Steel, reeling from the July flood damage in Johnstown, announced its own massive cuts. 3,500 jobs gone immediately, with thousands more to follow. These weren't temporary layoffs. These were permanent closures. The shockwaves rippled through every mill town in Pennsylvania and Ohio. By the end of the decade, the steel industry had invested essentially zero net capital between 1955 and 1980. Nearly 1/4 of all US steel was being manufactured using technology that was outdated by 50 years. The mills were old. The equipment was old. The processes were old. And the men running the companies were too proud or too stubborn or too blind to admit that the world had changed. The collapse, when it came, was swift and merciless. Between 1979 and 1987, the Pittsburgh region lost 133,000 manufacturing jobs. US steel production fell from the 1973 peak of 137 million metric tons to 67.7 million metric tons by 1982. That's a 50% decline in 9 years. Pittsburgh unemployment hit 17.1% in January of 1983. Beaver County hit 27.1%. Nearly half the nation's 450,000 steelworkers were laid off. Half of those who were laid off never worked in the industry again. When you got your layoff notice, it usually came with minimal warning. A supervisor would pull you aside at the end of your shift and tell you not to come back tomorrow. Sometimes you'd show up for work and find the gates locked. Sometimes there'd be a notice posted on a bulletin board. However it came, the result was the same. You were done. The job you'd expected to have for life was gone. For men who'd worked in the mills for 20 or 30 years, who'd never done anything else, who'd built their entire identities around making steel, the layoff was devastating in ways that went beyond economics. Sure, the loss of income was catastrophic. Most families had no savings to speak of because they'd never needed savings. The paycheck came every week. You paid your bills, you bought your groceries, you lived your life. The idea that the paycheck might stop was never seriously considered. But the psychological impact was even worse. What do you do when the only thing you've ever known how to do suddenly doesn't exist anymore? How do you explain to your kids that you can't afford new school clothes when last year you could afford anything they wanted? How do you look your wife in the eye when you've always been the provider and now you're sitting at home watching game shows while she works double shifts as a waitress? Some men never recovered. The suicide rate in steel towns spiked in the early 1980s. Alcoholism, already a problem in communities where hard drinking was part of the culture, got worse. Domestic violence increased. Marriages fell apart under the strain. Some men just disappeared, walked away from their families because they couldn't handle the shame of failing as providers. The lucky ones found other work, but it was never as good. A guy who'd been making $360 a week at the mill might get a job at a warehouse making $200, or driving a truck, or doing security work. Some guys ended up working at the shopping centres that had been built on the sites of closed mills. Imagine spending 30 years making steel in Homestead, then losing your job, then getting hired to work retail at the waterfront shopping centre that sits where the mill used to be. The psychological weight of that had to be crushing. The Mon Valley became what people started calling America's Rust Belt. Mills that had run 24 hours a day for a century went silent. The orange glow disappeared from the night sky. The river that had been the hardest working river in the world became quiet. And a generation of men who'd expected to work until retirement, who'd planned to pass their jobs to their sons, who'd built their entire identities around making steel, found themselves out of work with no prospects and no plan. Jerry Green, who was union president of Local 2600, captured the sense of loss with painful simplicity. It's sad every time that I have to drive into the plant. I see all the buildings that were torn down and the loss of jobs. One of the things that I miss about Bethlehem Steel, you could see the blast furnaces going, you could see the flames, and you could smell the steel company. I miss the dirt being on the cars because I knew that there was thousands of jobs that went with that. Think about that for a moment. He missed the dirt. He missed the pollution. Not because he enjoyed breathing toxic air, but because the dirt meant work. It meant jobs. It meant families eating dinner and kids going to school and mortgages getting paid. It meant a world that made sense, where hard work was rewarded, where you could count on something. And all of that disappeared. Bob Shoemaker spent 35 years moving steel around the clock at Bethlehem. Even decades later, he still thought about walking through the gates. I would like to look at the plant now and walk through the gate and go down through the tunnel and walk what we used to call the other world, like going down to the Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland, where you walk through the tunnel to another world. Another language down there too. Another world. That's exactly what it was. A world with its own language, its own rules, its own codes of honour and systems of justice. A world where you knew your place and your role and your brothers. A world that's gone now as completely as if it had never existed. The 1970s Pennsylvania steelworker lived in a reality that seems almost impossible to imagine today. He worked in temperatures hot enough to kill him. He breathed air poisonous enough to guarantee he'd die young. He operated equipment that could crush or burn or gas him in an instant. He did this for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, on a rotating shift schedule that never let his body rest. And he did it for decades. His father did it. His grandfather did it. He expected his son to do it, but he also earned enough money to own a home, to support his family on a single income, to take vacations and have hobbies and build a life that felt secure. He belonged to a union powerful enough to stand up to the biggest corporations in America. He belonged to a brotherhood that went deeper than most marriages. He made things that would outlast him by centuries. Bridges and buildings and ships and tanks. Real things. Things you could point to and say, I made that. The discrimination was real. The racism was real. The sexism was real. The danger was real. The environmental devastation was real. All of that is true and can't be minimized. But so is this. For a brief moment in American history, a working man without a college degree could support his family and retire with dignity. He could do hard, dangerous work and be respected for it. He could build a middle-class life with his hands and his back and his willingness to show up every day. That world is gone. The furnaces are cold. The orange glow no longer lights the night sky over Pittsburgh. The Monongahela River is quiet. The mills are either demolished or converted into shopping centres and entertainment venues. The men who worked there are dying off, taking their stories with them. But in the oral histories preserved in archives, in the union halls that still stand, in the bars where rolling rock still flows, in the memories passed down from grandfather to grandson, the steel mills of 1970s Pennsylvania endure. Not as they were romanticized, not as they were demonized, but as they actually were. A place of fire and danger and brotherhood. A place where men made America and were broken by it. A place that promised everything and delivered most of it, and then disappeared almost overnight. One steelworker, recorded in a PBS documentary, put it perfectly. When you started in a steel company, you were almost assured of a lifetime job, but we lasted longer than the steel company. They outlived the thing that was supposed to outlive them. And in that reversal lies the entire tragedy of American deindustrialization. The mills are gone. But the men who worked them, the families who depended on them, the communities that grew up around them, they're still here. Still trying to make sense of what happened. Still trying to explain to their grandchildren what it meant to walk through those gates every day into the fire. Still carrying in their bodies the graphite dust that never quite washed out, the hearing damage that never healed, the pride that never faded. That's what it was like to work in a Pennsylvania steel mill in the 1970s. It was the end of an era, the last chapter of a story that had defined America for a century. And the men who lived it knew, even as they were living it, that they were witnessing something that would never come again.